Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Retronaut. So, in the last episode, we looked at Computer and Video Games magazine, actually the first edition of that magazine, which came out in November of 1981. And I explained to you in the last episode that I came about looking at that magazine because I was actually looking at some editions of Zap 64, which came out, I think the first edition of this was 1985. And I realized that that was actually quite late in my sort of technology story, you know, when I actually came into using computers, which was in 1982, as far as I recall. So yeah, I decided to go back and have a look at an older magazine. I settled on Computer and Video Games, and we looked at the November issue, the first issue of that magazine in the last episode. So what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to move on. And I originally planned to just look at the next edition of the magazine. But I've decided to actually try and fit in two. So please bear with me. That does make this episode a little bit long, but I felt it actually made more sense like that because I didn't think the January edition of CMVG from 1982 was kind of jam-packed enough that it actually would warrant its own episode. So I've tried to fit it in here. Now, I want to give you an idea of actually what was going on in 1981 and 1982. So I put together a little montage here of some of the things that were going on to give you a feeling of where we are in time. There's nothing that quite screams the 80s like the Rubik's Cube. Now, the Rubik's Cube actually came out in 1980, but I'm showing it here because it was such a cultural phenomenon and a craze. And we don't tend to have crazes as much these days, but the 70s and 80s, there was a craze every couple of years. Yeah, so yeah, the Rubik's Cube, something that some people found fascinating and others despised. There was, of course, worldwide interest in the royal wedding of Prince Charles and Diana Spencer, something which was at first a bit of a fairy tale story, but over time it turned out that things were not quite as wonderful within the House of Spencer as everybody thought back in the beginning. But it started off very hopefully with a rather extravagant wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Another era-defining image is the relationship between Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister of the UK, and Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States. Reagan, famously an ex-actor, they basically seem to have got on like a house on fire. There are so many photo opportunities of these guys together. And on the other side of this triad, you have the Soviet Union, which was starting to thaw in terms of relationships between these countries. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, definitely an image that sort of sums up 1981 massively. 1981 was also the year in which MTV was launched, and these are literally the first few seconds of MTV. So these logos would have not been seen before. Interestingly, they chose a piece of music, which was Video Killed the Radio Star. Interesting choice of music to say that maybe that video was now more important than music, which of course it wasn't. You don't have the music video without the music, right? And I'm just going to show you a selection of music from that period, just to show you how diverse it was. So this era was typified as being post-punk. You have artists such as Toyah Willcox. She was a punk back in the day, but now she was transitioning more into the sort of era of the New Romantics and the New Wave, but still very much a punk ethic, challenging and aggressive. Again, another band which was quite challenging in the way Phil Oakey dressed, an androgynous appearance to himself, obviously makeup and the long hair on one side. So this was the era of challenging genders. That was definitely a big thing back in the 1980s, and there was definitely a lot of politics in pop, I think. Human League famously were very sort of active early on in politics, some of it a little bit funny the way they came out. But yeah, one of my favourite bands are from the era, the Human League. Another favourite of mine, Ultravox with Vienna, and a song that many people don't actually like because they don't really understand what it's about. But it's actually a mood piece. It's a kind of a bit nostalgic, and it has overtones of World War II, I suppose, film noir, cinematic aspect ratio to the images. One of the defining synthwave songs as well. Don't forget this was an era where synthesizers were being used more and more for the first time. That was challenging in a way because we were used to traditional musical instruments, guitars, violins, etc. And all of a sudden we had these instruments with a completely new sound, and Ultravox were a major part of that. And they also had very pointy sideburns as well. And another punk to new romantic translation, Adamant. Originally a punk, still with elements of punk, still quite challenging, a little bit scary to some people, also a little bit androgynous in the way that he dressed, but one of the classic artists of the 1980s, at least in the UK. But he's got a kind of mixture of a highwayman, a pirate, etc. So definitely part of the new romantic wave. And then you have oddities like this. I think it's Anika. It's a song called Japanese Boy, and it's just completely frivolous pop about somebody being in love with a Japanese boy. And obviously they've dressed up, they put some chopsticks in their hair, and they've got a nice wig, which was very common. I think she must have borrowed this one from Toya. So yeah, Japanese Boy just gives you an idea of how diverse music was during this era. There were so many different types of music. And finally, a very political piece, Ghost Town by The Specials. This was a favourite of mine. And it hints at the fact that the economy in the UK wasn't doing very well at all. And it's a song literally about urban decay and the fact that a place is becoming a ghost town. I actually think that might be Metropolitan Wharf, where I actually worked. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see this video and actually see them on the banks of the River Thames throwing stones into the water. So yeah, there we are, 1981. An interesting time, so much stuff going on culturally, and of course, a period in which microcomputers were obviously flooding into the UK and where the new microcomputer scene is being defined. So yeah, Ghost Town. Yeah, I remember it well. It was a time in the UK when the economy was not doing very well. And to be honest, it got, I think, worse really over the next few years, eventually culminating in the miners' strike, where basically the mining industry in the UK was kind of removed, expunged really. And that was a pretty dark time. But at this point in time, not so dark. As we saw, there was the royal wedding. So it was a bit of a feel-good year, actually, over here in the UK. In that there was a nice event that cheered everybody up a little bit. But yeah, I think it's really fascinating what happened in this year. So let's not dawdle about. We'll actually move straight on to having a look at the next edition, which is the December issue of CMVG from 1981. And I think at this time, I would have probably been in the market, not for a computer, because I still had my Atari VCS. I was still playing my console. But I think there were things like Game & Watch, which we'll see later. And there were also these handheld games where you could get sort of handheld versions of Pac-Man and Galaxians and things like that. So I think that's actually what I had that year. Plus maybe some other toys. You know, at this point I would have been 11 years old. So I think just about to go into secondary school, but I was still in primary school, to give you an idea of my age. So yeah, I would have been one of those people that was bang in the center of the sights of those people making those little handheld games. So anyway, let's move on and have a look at what happened in the next edition, or rather in the next two editions. But before we do so, let's have a quick word from our sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay, where you can make your tech dreams a reality. And right now, PCBWay is running its project design contest, and it's going strong and in its 7th year. Previously, it was limited to electronics projects, but now the field has been expanded to electronics projects, mechanical projects, or projects based on the STM32 series of chips. And of course, there are some really cool prizes up for grabs. So why don't you get involved? And of course, don't forget, you can enter an electronics project, a mechanical project, or a project based on the STM32 series of chips. PCBWay, PCB prototyping the easy way. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Here we are. It's December 1981. And I think this cover is not bad. It's not amazing. I find it a little bit confusing visually. I'm not quite sure what I'm seeing. Obviously, there's some kind of clipper type boat sailing around the Horn, as it says there, round the Horn, towards the bottom of the screen. The painting of the rock behind it, because they've chosen this kind of green color, I kind of confuse it with a sea, which is that blue color, the bottom blue, sort of petrol blue. And it almost looks like a massive wave behind the ship. I mean, if that was a wave, then, you know, it's game over, isn't it? Excuse the pun. But yeah, anyway, it's an all right cover. Not as good as the first one. Doesn't really leap off the shelves quite as well. But anyway, there we go. So it says, use this handy free gift in our great template competition. I don't know what gift they're talking about. Oh, hang on. It must have been on the cover, right? There must have been some kind of item attached to the cover. Anyway, that's obviously long gone. So I'm not really sure what that free gift was. So that's a pity. Anyway, underneath it says ZX81, PET, Apple, as we said in the last edition, Apple II, that would be pet, is the pet Tandy. It's not really saying what Tandy it is. Anyway, it says it's got programs for these and more. And what it means by programs is, as we saw in the last episode, they're listings, basic listings that you have to type in. It's very laborious. If you want to learn more about that, go back to the previous episode and have a watch of that. But yeah, it's not free software in the sense of something on tape or floppy disk. It's actually printed and you have to type it in. Round the Horn, a thrilling seafaring race. So I don't know if that's something they're reviewing or if that's one of the listings. I'm assuming it's probably one of the listings, let's imagine. And it says, are you the world's best arcade game player? Entry forms in sight. So it looks like there's some kind of arcade competition going to happen. Interesting. And then it says solve the cube. And as you can see there, it's got a picture of the Rubik's Cube, which I'm assuming this was the era of the Rubik's Cube when that was an absolute fever. Anyway, let's crack on with the next one. So in the last episode, I mentioned the Mailbag page and I didn't actually show it. So I thought it was good that we showed it in this episode and we'll just quickly run through it. Top left, I think it's actually a mock basic program. It doesn't even say what it's actually meant to be used for, but I think that's just a bit of fun. Then there is an article about, what's he talking about here? A long-lasting success. I have a Tandy TRS-80. Very nice. And I was looking forward to keying in Tarot when I have the time. However, I'm thinking about upgrading to the new Model 3, but I'm waiting to see whether any games is available for it. Do you know if any software is going to be made available for it? And their answer is the Model 3 does have a conversion utility that you can use Model Disk with and to run on the upgraded machine. The technique is well documented in the Model 3's TRS-DOS manual. Interesting. Okay. Bottom left, let's see what it's got here. Oh yeah, it's quite long-winded, this letter. Basically, it goes into the point that they wanted to join in a competition, but they don't actually have a computer. And towards the end of the letter, it actually reveals the fact that this person's actually teaching O-level, which is ordinary level. That's a qualification in the UK, when you go to school, secondary school. But unfortunately, in the class for computing, we don't actually have any computers. It says they're arriving in January. I know, it's classic, isn't it? Can you imagine sitting in that computing class, learning about how to use computers and you haven't actually got any? Anyway, that's the state of computing in the UK at this era. Don't forget the BBC Micro hasn't really come out yet. That's the computer that's meant to go into classes to allow people to learn how to use computers. So yeah, still very nascent. Anyway, on the second page, it says here, having purchased the first edition of your magazine, I was sorry to find so many faults in City Bomber. I have a Z80 with a new RAM expansion and I am very new to programming, but apparently eventually they got it to work. And the editor replies, very sorry about that. I'm not surprised. I mean, the number of times you would type in a listing and it didn't have a bug in it was very rare. They pretty much always had bugs in them. And the truth of the matter is the editors of the magazines, I assume, didn't actually type in these programs. They just took it on face value that they actually ran. Maybe they had somebody in the team who was technical and would run through it, but one has to assume that they didn't because very often you would type in the listing and it wouldn't work. And I think it was seen as a bit of a challenge in those days that that's how you learn to program, was by debugging a 400-page list. But yeah, a lot of people have put off BASIC for a long time, actually. And I think I was one of those people, to be honest. But anyway, yeah, maybe I was just a little bit too young to be doing that kind of stuff, maybe. So what's the next letter? Caught in a trap. 44. Oh yeah, this one's an interesting one. This reader is saying that they want, well, the magazine is printing 9 different basic programs for 9 different computers, which is, commendable, I suppose. But this user, this reader, wants to actually have all 9 of those programs work on their computer. So let's say they've got a ZX81. They want every single program to work on their ZX81. So they want the magazine to print some kind of universal translator, which will tell them, let's say, for instance, there's a poke, which is a memory address on a machine. And if you poke that address, it changes the screen color, right? They want to know what the equivalent of that is for every single machine out of the 9. Now, it sounds like a good idea, but the reality is some computers may not have that feature whatsoever. The way the sound works on one machine may be radically different from the way it works in another. So I think they're being a little bit naive that you can just take a piece of software, change the poke values or various other things into other values and bang, it'll work on another machine. And I think the editor replies, nice idea, not going to work. A chance to review. Thank you for a marvelous magazine. I'll paraphrase what he's going to say. I would like to review for you. Is there any chance of it? Now, I was interested by this because I thought the editor would come back and say, no chance whatsoever. But apparently they do actually use third-party reviewers, and he is actually open to having more reviewers on the team. So he reaches out and basically says, send in your details. I guess maybe we'll do a review with you and we'll see how it goes. So I think that's pretty cool. You know, they're open to actually having readers write in and, you know, apply for the job as a reviewer. I assume that over time, that would be something that would stop happening. So this one's pretty cool. Bill Budge. Now, Bill Budge, I first encountered his software when I bought a Commodore 64 1541 disk drive. I think it was in 1983, Christmas of 1983. And with that disk drive came 10 games. Oh my God, it was such a good Christmas. One of the games I got was Pinball Construction Set, and that was written by Bill Budge. So I think it was originally written for the Apple II, and Raster Blaster, the game that you can see here, was an Apple II game. Now, I've actually got some footage of it here playing away, and I've got to say, I'm actually really impressed. It's incredibly reminiscent of Pinball Construction Set. So I think what Bill Budge did was, rather than just writing a piece of software that emulated a single pinball table, he did something pretty crazy, which is he actually wrote a system which would allow him to build a pinball table from components. So he could then put together a pinball table using that editor, and then that editor then went on to be released as Pinball Construction Set. This is a game I will have a look at in the future. I actually owned it. You know, a couple of years ago, I went back and I bought a lot of the games from back then. So I'll show you this game to you in the future. And it's actually part of the Electronics Arts games where they have really fantastic cover art, and they also feature the coders inside. So yeah, we'll have a look at that in the future. So I'm showing this to you, not because I really want to talk about the ZX81. We talked about that in the last episode. Really good computer for its time, very limited, but expandable and very cheap. As you can see there, £69, which was actually super cheap, even for 1981. Today, you're talking more, I don't know, £300 or something like that. But back then, that was an affordable machine for somebody in the working class. And the ZX81 was actually a pretty dominant machine in this era. And we'll find that out not so much in this edition, but in future editions where, for instance, we look at the mailbag and we'll see the number of people writing in who actually own a ZX81. I'm showing you this page because of WHSmith. WHSmith is a UK-based, and they still exist, newsagent. Back in the day when you were going to the newsagent to get your magazines for video gaming, you also had shelves in there where you had the video games. This was a common thing in the UK. You didn't really have video game stores. Don't forget this was a very new field. So you had these forward-looking retailers who would think, well, what's this? Maybe we can make some money from it. Another retailer that actually did that was John Menzies. And I've actually found, this is rather fantastic, a picture of John Menzies in Swansea. You can see it on the left there on the corner. And John Menzies was the store where I first saw a Spectrum being displayed. That particular branch of John Menzies was a newsagent's on the ground floor, but they had a basement. And I remember going in there one day and somebody must have recommended it to me because it was, you know, pretty much tucked away. And I went down into the basement and there was this really nice display of computers. And in, I think it was the Christmas of 1982, so a year later than this, I actually went in there and saw a Spectrum, and I was very impressed with, I think it was Underworld. Yeah, fantastic looking game on what went on to become a classic machine. And it already showed its promise because on display in there in, as I said, the Christmas of 1982, that game really caught my eye. And I thought, wow, that's a really cool looking game. I'd love to have that machine. Wow, this edition of CMVG has got some fantastic games being released. I don't know where to start, really. I mean, the obvious one is King Kong Goes Crazy in a Cabinet. And it says here, the box office success of King Kong. There was a movie, actually, a live action movie, which came out in the late 70s, I think it was, 1979 or something like that. Look at this here. King Kong now looks likely to become a success in a box, or at least in an arcade cabinet, in the game Donkey Kong. Now, I don't need to introduce Donkey Kong to anyone, right? It's a classic. But it's just amazing, isn't it? Here we are, 1981, Donkey Kong hasn't been released. I couldn't believe it when I saw this page, because one of my earliest sort of memories of the arcade is playing Donkey Kong. And obviously, you know, Space Invaders came out before it. Over in the US, you had Pong. I never encountered Pong over here in the UK. I think by the time the arcade revolution sort of really kicked it off over here, Pong was long gone. It was old technology. So we never really saw Pong over here. Maybe we did in London, I suppose, in some of the arcades in central London. But down in South Wales, we didn't. Now, I actually was quite lucky because I grew up in a town called Port Talbot, and it's an industrial town. There's a large steelworks at one end. At this point in time, there was actually a large oil refinery at the other, but in between was this massively long beach, like 2 or 3 miles long. And this was in the days before people being able to fly off to Spain on holidays. So in the summer holidays, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people would come down to the beach and enjoy themselves in Port Talbot. And because of that, it actually did have arcades. So I used to go down to the beach, and this is where I would have seen games like this. And they were also present in other parts of the town, in different cafes and places like that. So yeah, amazing Donkey Kong. The famous story about Donkey Kong is it's a mistranslation. It was meant to be Monkey Kong, as far as I understand it, but it ended up being badly translated and they ended up being Donkey Kong. I don't know at which point Nintendo found out that that was actually a mistake, but yeah, it's quite funny that actually happened. And even to this day, it's Donkey Kong, even to this day, even though it's meant to be Monkey Kong. So anyway, yeah, I always used to think as a kid, donkey? There's no donkey in it. Why is he Donkey Kong? Is he meant to be stupid or something? Maybe that was how they sort of justified it. I don't know. And to the right of it, of course, Frogger, another classic. And I loved Frogger when I was a kid. Quite a simple game, you know, get from one side of the road to the other. It's almost like a chicken game. Why did the chicken cross the road? Or in this case, why did the frog cross the road? I don't know, because it made a good game, I suppose. But yeah, another classic game from the era, Frogger. And then we've got Galaxians 2, bottom left. It basically explains that it's a second version of Galaxians from the same company as Galaxians. And then this is the weird bit. If you go all the way down to the bottom, it says one other important change is the name. This new breed answers to the name Galgas. I don't know what happened there. I don't know if that's a misprint. I don't know if they were fed the wrong information. I suppose it's possible that the game was renamed just before it was released to, as far as I know, it would be Galaga, right? It's not Galgas. So yeah, interesting that they got all that information and they got the name wrong. Also, it's, you know, it's blatantly obvious when I say this, but at this point, there are no pictures still no photographs in the magazine. And it's so weird to read these articles about these games, these classic games, but no screenshots to actually show what the game is like. So the magazine still hasn't quite got its act together in terms of taking photographs off a screen. And as a result of that, I read this one here, Aliens Above the Skyline, piloting your craft above a New York skyline. And then skipping down, it says, Space Odyssey is reminiscent of the Defender game. You know, the Defender classic game from Williams. What I find really weird is I never heard of this game. This was a game that never crossed my path anywhere. So I've actually sorted out, and there it is. It does look sort of reminiscent of Defender, I suppose, but looking ahead into the future, it reminds me more of something like R-Type. What's really interesting as well is that this game, at a certain point, flips perspective. So it's actually a top-down shooter instead of a left-to-right shooter, which is really interesting. It's only 1981, and people are already trying new ideas out like that. So I'm kind of sad, actually, I never came across Space Odyssey, because it does look like quite a good game. But there we are. You know, there were only so many cabinets in my town, and it's just something that I never came across back in the day. So why do I want to look at this page? Okay, so it's a bunch of different adverts again. This is the age of so many different computers, right? Top left, we've got the VIC-20. It says color computer. That's actually not the name of the machine. It's quite funny. It's a bit like the Tandy color computer, right? But that actually was the name of the machine. Anyway, it's telling you that it's got color, right? It's not just a black and white machine. To the right of it, you've got the Acorn Atom. We saw that in the last edition. Really cool machine, something we'll definitely have to look at in the future. Then you've got another advert for Atari. There were lots of adverts for Atari at this time. Really interestingly, bottom left, I should point this out before we look at the main event here, the Apple computer actually on sale. And there it shows it as the Tower of Power, as it was called, which is 2 disk drives and a monitor on top of them. And you were told by Apple not to do this because it could overheat the machine, but pretty much everybody did it. I must admit, it looks very cool. And it says here, Apple II Plus 48K, £800, or well, 790. So not too bad. You know, it's got 48K in it. And if you remember, if we look above, you can see there we've got the Atari 800, and it's got 16K and it's £645. So for only, well, I mean, I say it's a lot of money, for about £150 more, you could get an Apple II with 48K in it. Now, I would say out of the two machines, the 800 is probably more capable in terms of playing games, but the Apple II is actually more capable in terms of expandability. And if you wanted to use it, say, as a business machine. So, you know, it swings and roundabouts there. It does say the disk drive and a controller is £383 for the Apple II. Disk drive without a controller, £303. There's a Pascal card for it, £264. These are very expensive items. So this is more sort of aimed at the serious business user or, you know, pro coder, I suppose. Then there's a Euro color card, which I assume is to get the graphics working in color, in PAL, because originally it used a trick with NTSC to get colors. And then it says the Hitachi 9-inch monitor, which is pretty tiddly, but that's the kind of size of monitor that a lot of people use to fit on top of the two disk drives, £146. Now, the main event on the page is the Tangerine Microtan. And when I read this, it sounds like something's gone terribly wrong in the tanning salon, you know, where you've had like fake tan sprayed on and you've ended up with a Tangerine Microtan. But in fact, it's a computer. And you can see there it says Microtan 65 kit, £79. I'm assuming that's 35 pence, which is interesting. And then there's a Microtan 65 built, and it's £90. It doesn't really give you any kind of information about what the machine is capable of. It says here, we hold a complete stock of all the Tangerine equipment. Send us a self-addressed envelope or phone for details. So something we'll have to look at in the future. What exactly is a Tangerine Microtan, apart from a mistake that happened in the tanning salon? But yeah, interesting. Looks like quite a nice keyboard actually, but it looks like it's kind of attached to some kind of, looks like a disk drive or something. Interesting. Yeah, okay. So yeah, Tangerine Microtan, something to be looked up in the future. So I wanted to show you this page because there are actually some games here for the Apple II, I think, by the looks of it. Yeah, have your own pinball machine within the Apple II. And there's the game we saw from earlier, Raster Blaster, £16.95. I recall from the other episode that £16.95 would be something like £55 today, something like that. And then you got Pool 1.5, and that's £18. And then you go down and you got Zork. Now, who needs to be told about Zork? Well, some people might do. It's the first text adventure from Infocom. I'm not sure if by this point they'd actually published all three games. I have to assume that they haven't because they haven't listed it there. So that's interesting as well. We're back at a time when Zork hadn't actually been published, the full range of three games. It had already been developed on a PDB-10, but it hadn't actually been released yet on microcomputers by the looks of it. So yeah, that's kind of fascinating. £24. Wow, that's pretty expensive. I'll take a guess at that. Maybe £80 today? Yeah, pretty expensive. Now, that's a game without any graphics, right? It's a text adventure. I loved it. I loved Zork. But yeah, it was a premium product back in those days. But yeah, interesting. There you go. So, you know, there are Apple IIs being sold in the UK, and there are people actually catering to them in terms of selling software. So the Apple II definitely was a thing over here, but obviously costing, what was it, £800? Yeah, there weren't that many people actually buying them, obviously. So let's have a look at this page. At the top, we've got ZX81, Atom and Vic. And I think he's selling, what are these, books? Yeah, so books. Getting acquainted with your VIC-20. The same thing again, getting acquainted with your Acon and getting acquainted with his ZX81. So I have to assume this is a bunch of different guides. Now, what's interesting here is the book for the VIC-20 is £5.95. For the Acon is £7.95, a lot more for some reason. And then for your ZX81, it's the cheapest price yet. So it looks to me that rather cheekily, this author is actually selling books priced for the market of each machine. So the cheapest machine gets the cheapest book, and the most expensive machine, the Acon. Well, actually, the Acon Atom isn't that expensive, is it? So yeah, a bit of a mystery that. Why is the Acon book for the Atom so expensive? It's really weird, isn't it? Yeah, anyway, there we go. So, and then you've got another book, Mastering Machine Code, which is pretty cool, on your ZX81. I didn't really encounter machine code myself, assembly, whatever you want to call it, until probably something like 1984, something like that. I got bored with, you know, twiddling around with BASIC, and I decided to try and have a crack at assembly. But it's interesting that people would have been trying things out like that back in 1981. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. Then underneath, you've got another one of these group adverts where you've got the VIC-20 being sold, the Acon Atom, the Video Genie 2, the TRS-80 Model 3, and oh, look at the prices on that. Wow. 1,596. It's quite hard to work out what these prices are, isn't it? With an 80-track double density drive, that's just a floppy drive, £2,000. Caramba, that is an expensive machine. Way more expensive than even the Apple II. So that's interesting. We'll have to have a look at the prices for that and I'll put it up on screen. But yeah, that's a bit of a shocker. That is an expensive machine. Wow. And then to the right of it, you've got the TIAC disk drives. I'm not sure what they work for. It says here, with the video Genie, the North Star Horizon, Super Brain, NASCOM. So it sounds like these drives actually work with a number of different machines. And then at the bottom of the advert, we've got the Sharp MZ80K, which is a machine that we had a quick look at in the last episode. So as we gave a little bit of love to the Apple II in terms of gaming, I thought we would have a look at this page as well here. TRS-80 in Surrey. So where is it in Surrey? Because I live in Surrey. Woodcock Road, Wallington in Surrey. Oh, I don't know where Wallington is. I've been living here for 20 years, but I'm not native to Surrey, so I don't know everywhere in the area. But anyway, you can see here there are TRS-80 games being sold in the UK. So you've got Space Shuttle, Zost in space. Don't know what happens to you when you get Zost in space, but it doesn't sound good. And they're £10, so a little bit cheaper. Cribbage, £14.36. I don't think I'd want to pay £14.36 for a game of cribbage on a computer. Probably a game better played with the physical items, right? You know, a card game. VisiCalc. VisiCalc, which was originally developed on the Apple II, right? So it looks like at this point it's already been ported to the TRS-80 and it costs £60. Wow. So, you know, that's hundreds of pounds obviously today, which makes sense, right? That's a professional piece of software for doing your accounts and whatever. Pinball, poker. Yeah, it's actually a pretty good range of software there, isn't it? But unfortunately, I can't see Zork, which is a bit disappointing. I know that actually came out for the TRS-80. In fact, from what I recall, it was the first machine it was released on. So I would kind of expect it to be in that list there, but doesn't seem to have made the cut in this particular case. Oh well. So again, an advert in the same magazine, Innovate TRS-80 Genie software. So this is something that I supposed in the last episode, and it turns out to be true. It looks like the TRS-80 and the Genie are compatible. So what was the Genie? Some kind of rip-off of the TRS-80? Because over in the UK, the TRS-80 doesn't seem to be sold very often, but the Genie does. So I'm assuming maybe that the Genie is a cut down, cost reduced, a clone basically of the TRS-80. And it needs to be because, well, actually that was the TRS-83, wasn't it? So I don't know how much actually the TRS-80 costs at this point. I've not really seen it on sale in the magazine yet. So we'll have to keep an eye out for that, because right now I'm not quite sure how much the TRS-80 is costing in December of 1981. And here we are, as I said, the Genie, as we saw in the last episode, what looks like to be a pretty capable machine. I've got to say, built-in tape deck, really nice looking keyboard there, looks like a mechanical keyboard. So yeah, it's a cool machine. I wouldn't mind coming across a Genie and trying one out in the future. It's quite a nice looker, isn't it? You know, it's got a definite aesthetic of the time. The TRS-80 machines, they're quite big. And I would imagine that you don't really find them very often over in the UK. And this looks like a much more portable machine, right? So maybe that's something I could get on the channel in the future if I can actually source one from somewhere, because I'm assuming that they're probably quite rare. So this is something I wanted to get round to in the last episode, but I didn't actually get to it. And that is the review page. Now, in the last episode, I showed you, I think it was news, and I was saying that the news page and the reviews page are very similar. It's got some quite nice artwork here. Looks like it's been done in markers again, I think. So they got an illustrator and they're just basically using ink markers, which are something you don't really get that much these days. But when I was in college doing graphic design, learning graphic design, it was very common to have these markers, and I really liked actually using them, and you could produce very quick illustrations using them. And you could actually put the markers over the top of each other to kind of get transparency effects. And I'll leave it to you to read one of these, but you know, as I said in the last edition, they're very descriptive. You know, let's have a quick read about Can Life Exist in 1K? When there's only 1K of memory to play with, the programmer is faced with a real challenge. Sinclair have come up with 6 games for its ZX81, and although the games are necessarily simple in concept, Games Pack number 1 represents good value at £3.95. It goes on to describe the game, and I find these reviews problematic, and I think it's because I just got into what turns out to be a luxury of actually having a score. Now, why does that matter? Well, You can look, let's say you have a magazine like Zap, which is what, 5 years later than this. You could be leafing through a copy of Zap, and maybe you're a busy person. You don't want to read every review, right? So you could look at the score, and for instance, if a game is a stinker, it's getting 10% score overall, you can just say, I'm not going to read that review because why do I want to learn about a game I'm probably never going to get and bother playing because apparently it's terrible. At the same time, you see a game and it's getting like 80%, 70%. You would read it then, right? You'd want to see what that game, why is it that they love it so much? So in a way, the scores are king, The article itself backs up and explains to you about the game. And then you have photographs of the game as well. So you don't have any photographs of the game, so you can't see it. A game could be beautiful, like for the time it could have been cutting edge, fantastic graphics, but you can't see that. And there's no score. And I'm not sure they ever tell you anything about sound either, By the time you get to Zap, they're telling you what the sound is like, I think, if I remember rightly, what the gameplay is like, graphics, etc. Right? So it's breaking down the game, giving each part a score, and then you get an overall score, and then you can make your mind up if you want to read the review. But this is what it was like in the second edition of Computer and Video Games. If you want, pause the video, have a read of the reviews, and see what you think. The new Texas TI-99 4A. I have no idea where it gets the name from. What's the 99 all about in the 4A? I'll have to read up about that. 42K personal computer, only £275. Not bad, actually. The price is pretty good. This was, I think, if I remember rightly, touted as, well, actually it says there, doesn't it? The 16-bit processor running at 3 to 5 megas. 3 to 5 megahertz or 3.5? Well, that's a bit vague, isn't it? 3 to 5. Who knows what it is? It says there's 26K ROM, which is pretty big, including 14K of BASIC. And it's got graphics language interpreter. I don't know what that means. It's got a 4K monitor, which means you can do, I assume, assembly, or at least look in the memory. It's got 16K of user RAM, expandable to 48K. Okay, so maybe not so good. But the thing about this machine was, even though it was touted as a 16-bit processor, it worked at 16-bit internally, but it actually had an 8-bit bus on the machine. So in fact, it actually was an 8-bit machine, but it ran 16-bit internally. So yeah, if it was a full 16-bit machine like an Amiga or an Atari ST, you could justify that, if the entire bus architecture was 16-bit, but it's not. It's actually an 8-bit machine. Anyway, beautiful machine. I went to Woolworth in our town centre, and that was a machine which I used to see in the display case, and it was very attractive. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, wouldn't mind one of those. But then, right next to it was the Atari 800. And they both look great, to be honest. Time has gone on to say that I suppose out of that race, it was the Atari 800 that actually won. But back in the day, it was a very attractive machine. And I know a lot of people love it. I know that Usagi Electric has got a bit of obsession about it, where he's bought all the sidecar expansions that you can get to it, which plug in the side. And you can turn it into this absolutely massive, it's not really a tower of power, it's a train of gain. I don't know. What's a nice rhyme? Train of something or other. It's just this massively long thing with like a printer and a voice synthesizer, an extra memory and a disk drive, and incredible stuff. But these days, Texas Instruments is a company that we don't think about as being one of the powerhouses of this era, but in fact it was. They produced some really fantastic chips, and they, as you can see, they built their own machine. So yeah, a machine I would love to have a try on someday. Not sure if I have room to fit one in my own personal collection, but I wouldn't mind. Game and watch. I've got mixed feelings about this, but it's really, really interesting. So my family was working class. They didn't have a great deal of money. We weren't starving, but at the same time, we weren't going on holiday every year to overseas locales. So money was tight. And I remember there was a shop in our town called Family Value. Family Value was a place where you went to get things pretty cheap, house furnishings, things like that. And I remember I wanted a computer. I actually had an Atari VCS, so I was lucky to have that. I managed to get enough money together, and my mother had given me some money, and we managed to get an Atari VCS for me, and I was very happy. I was a lucky child to have that. But sometimes we would go around our town centre, and I would walk around with them, and they would then gravitate their way into Family Value. And then there were a number of these on the shelf, and they were sort of touting these to me as something that I could have for Christmas instead of a computer. I remember I wasn't happy. I was like looking at these. And the way these worked is, if you're not familiar with them, if you're a younger person, they were a liquid crystal display. So I suppose a little bit of a sort of precursor of the LED screens that we have today. They have quite high persistence. I don't know if you've ever seen one of them, but you could play these games and the characters on them were in fixed positions on the screen and they could be turned on and off. So for instance, you might have a little character at the bottom of the screen who's meant to catch coconuts, and the character could only be in one of 6 positions, and then the coconuts would fall from one of 6 positions, if that makes sense. And you would move your character to left and right and catch the coconuts. So it wasn't a full computer game. It was a kind of very basic game, but they were quite good fun. I must admit, the name I always thought was a bit weird, Game and Watch, because if you look at that there, you can see top right, there is actually a watch, or rather I should say a clock. That's the correct translation. I mean, you wouldn't strap this thing to your wrist, would you? And pop into school wearing this massive game on your wrist. I mean, you could do. You'd probably get beaten up in the playground, but or people would flock around and want to play on your wrist and probably just drag you across the grass as they played on your game. Now, a really interesting thing is, it says here it's made by CGL. I'm not sure who CGL was. It's actually on the game itself. But in fact, the game is made by Nintendo. And this was a massive hit for Nintendo. We saw earlier in this episode that Donkey Kong was released. Well, this range of games produced by Nintendo made them a fortune. I think they sold something like 43 million of them worldwide. I think they sold about 12 or something like that, 12 million in Japan. But they went on to sell massively all over the globe, I think. Probably primarily in America and the UK. But obviously, well, not really. They probably sold across Europe as well. So this is one of the reasons why Nintendo went on to become such a successful game company. Who knows, if they hadn't produced these, maybe they wouldn't have got the money together to do the Nintendo Entertainment System. You know, history would be completely different in video gaming if it wasn't for these things. So although I've got this mixed relationship with them, I quite like them. I didn't want to have them given to me as a computer. You know, I wanted to have an actual microcomputer, not this little toy thing. But at the same time, they were kind of cool. I would go into school and my friends would have these and they would give it to you and you could have a play on it. And they were pretty cool, but yeah, they were not a microcomputer. And finally, you've been waiting for it the entire episode. We're finally going to have a look at the hardcore stuff. Now, cover your eyes because, you know, you may be a little bit shocked and ashamed by what you see next. But anyway, here we go. Here it is. Hardcore. Okay, all right. It's probably not what you were expecting. Yeah, it's actually a list of computers that were out at the time. Now, they didn't have this in the first edition. And I got to, I think it was the 4th edition. And then I realized they had this. And then I went back to this edition, well, to see when they actually introduced this new feature. And I've got to say, it's actually really cool. Now, in future editions, what they do is they actually go into detail about each one of these machines, or most of these machines anyway. But it's really interesting because it gives you a list of all the machines that they were aware of. They, you know, the magazine were aware of back in the day. So you've got the Acorn Atom, the Apple, which is the Apple II, I assume, the Atari 400 and 800, the BBC computer. So the BBC Micro is already on sale, although we're not really seeing it advertised in the magazine yet, are we? So they're aware of it. It says here the price is put at $235 for the 16K computer and $335 for the 32K version. So I know the Dragon 32, when it came out, I think was about $200 for 32K. And here you've got the BBC Micro for $335. Now, the BBC Micro was a very capable computer, but if you're looking at the two machines, they both got reasonably good graphics. They both got 32K of memory, but you've got to pay £135 more for the BBC Micro. So it was a bit of a premium machine. And because of that, very few people actually had them here in the UK. They were mostly restricted to schools, to be honest. But anyway, it was a really good machine. We've got the Die. We talked about that in the last episode. And what to say, personal computer made by data applications, etc. The NASCOM says that 2 of them are available. And the NASCOM 2 is the more powerful one with 8K of RAM. So that's a more limited machine. And it says here the kit for that is £125. The New Brain. Then you've got the PET. We know what the PET is, the Commodore PET. Very successful machine for Commodore. As we saw in the last edition, the Sharp MZ80K. It says here one of the more expensive computers out there. What does it say? The price is $460 for 48K. Not that expensive because the Atari 800 is £600 for the 40. Actually, no, it's £600 for the 16K. So yeah, maybe the Atari 800 is way more expensive still. So I actually think that's better value. But yeah, anyway, you've got the Sharp PC211. Not really sure what that is. Hopefully That will turn up in an advert in a following edition. We've got the Sinclair. They don't really say what it is. It says well, what I mean is they don't say what it is in the title. It's a bit like the Apple. You know, it's not actually the Apple, it's actually the Apple II. So the Sinclair at this point is the Z80 and the ZX81. So you've got two machines from Sinclair Research. The Sorcerer. The XD Sorcerer is a home computer with a sizable games following, but it's more expensive. It's £749. Again, it's another machine I've never heard of. We've not seen a single advert, I think, unless anybody spotted one in this edition. So we'll have to keep an eye out for the Sorcerer in the future. The Tandy TRS-80, which we've seen appear in this magazine a couple of times. Here we are. The Model 1 costs £459, but comes complete with a monitor. That's pretty good, you know, with a monitor. And it says the Model 3 is an integral unit made up of a keyboard, 12-inch screen, and 2 slide slots. And it costs £499. Well, that's weird, because I'm pretty sure we saw the Model 3 earlier on, and it was like way over $1,000. So maybe that's like with disk drives or something. Yeah, it's actually much cheaper here. Then we got the Tangerine Microtan. We saw that earlier in this edition, and it's not a mistake that happens in a tanning salon where there's been a mistake with the machinery. It's actually a computer. Then we got the TI 99 4A. What was it? 4A, wasn't it? I think. What it says here, it's been recently relaunched by Texas Instrument. It consists of a separate keyboard with graphics facilities. A separate keyboard. That's interesting. That's not the machine we saw earlier. So did Texas Instruments do another machine which actually had a separate keyboard to the TI 99? Interesting. The VIC-20. Okay, well, we know what the VIC-20 is. The second big hit from Commodore. The PET was aimed at mainly the education and business market. And then they produced the VIC-20, which was really aimed at consumers. Much cheaper machine and a beloved machine of many. Very many people actually had the VIC-20, and then as soon as the Commodore 64 came out, they sold up and they moved on to the 64, and the rest of it is history. But before the Commodore 64, the VIC-20 was a big hit in its own right. And then finally, the Video Genie, which we've ascertained now is some kind of clone. What does it say here? The Genie is made by Yaka and is a popular games machine. It is compatible with the Tandy TRS-80 Model 1. It can have 16 to 48K, and there are disk drives available. The basic unit costs from £369 and is available from Low Electronics of Matlock in Derbyshire. Interesting, suggesting that it's only actually available from one supplier. But I think we've seen in the magazine, it actually has been advertised by a number of different suppliers. So maybe, is that Low just advertising the same machine over and over again? I don't think it is. So yeah, the Video Genie, very cool machine. Definitely one I would like to have a look at in the future. And then we finish off with the UK 101. Another new machine. This machine comes in either kit form or ready built with a memory capacity of 4 to 40K. That's an unusual range, isn't it? With an expansion board. It contains television and cassette interfaces. So it's one of these kit machines, but I've not actually seen that in any adverts yet, but maybe it turns up somewhere. So we'll have to keep an eye out for the UK 101. So that's it for December of 1981. We're going to move on now into a new year, and I'm going to keep it quite brief if I can, and we're going to look at January of 1982. So let's take a look at the cover. So it says the magazine that makes computers fun, fun, fun. I remember in the first edition, I think they said it was the most fun magazine in the universe or something, but they seem to have calmed down a bit by this edition, by the third edition. What do I think of the artwork? I think this is actually pretty cool. You've got a wizard standing on, what is it called, a menhir? I think that's how you pronounce it, which is like a burial kist, which I am assuming would have had like an earth bank around it originally. Now they're sort of eroded away, and you have these standing stones with a big stone standing on top. And he's got, it's hard to work out, isn't it? I think he's got like a spell book, which is he's dropping or something like that. And then he's holding his staff above his head and casting out, I don't know, energy balls or snowballs or something towards this dragon, this kind of ice dragon. What does it say is inside? It says the art of seduction, computer style. Interesting. I don't know what that's all about. Drag and Druggin, treasure hunt, a feast of fantasy inside. I'm assuming that these might be games which are listings again, you know, basic games that you actually type in. It says 3 Sinclair 1K Wonder Games, plus programs for PET, Apple II, Tandy, must be TRS-80, I suppose, and many more. And it says, win our best arcade player title. So yeah, in the last edition, there was the asking for people to write in to join this competition, and they're reiterating that here. And it also says, take on snooker's Steve Davis. So for those people in America who are not, or other parts of the world that are not really into snooker, Steve Davis was a superstar of snooker back in the 1980s, and he was world champion on multiple occasions. So an Apple II advert, again, the famous Tower of Power, which is your Apple II. I think there's an Apple II Plus they're showing here, with 2 disk drives on top and a monitor. And if you got that Tower of Power, you were a very lucky person, because that was an expensive bit of kit. I really like this advert. One of the few sort of adverts that you see which is actually nice quality, I think. It's actually pretty cool because it's a 2-color print. And I think they made a lot out of those 2 colors. It's actually pretty cool. It looks like Laskys was a chain. It's saying that they have branches in Birmingham, Bristol, Chester, Edinburgh, Preston, Manchester, Glasgow, Sheffield, Liverpool and London. Unfortunately, none of them in Wales. And what does it say here? 2-year parts and labour guaranteed on all Apple products supplied by Laskys. Well, you'd kind of expect that, wouldn't you? Because they were very expensive machines. So it says, the product, Apple II, Euro Plus, which means obviously it's designed for the European market, 48k. And the price is net, that's a bit confusing, isn't it? £675. VAT was £101. And the total price was £776. So I think in the last edition, I asked the question, what was VAT at this point? So let's have a look. So it looks like at this point it was 15%, and it's now crept up to 20%. I wish we'd go back to the days when it was 15%. Yeah, it crept up a few years ago here in the UK, and it's stuck at that point, and it's horrible. Yeah, VAT is really nasty. I know that in America you have sales tax, right? And I know that it's generally pretty low. And I know that in some states in America it's actually 0%. Well, over here in the UK, everywhere it's 20%. It's pretty horrible. But yeah, the total price with VAT, £776. Wow, that is a lot, isn't it? I'm assuming that for that price, you're getting what, the monitor and the disk drives? Doesn't actually say that though, does it? Yeah, so that maybe the image is a little bit deceptive. So I'm assuming that is a 48k Apple II Plus. Anyway, nice advert. Not so happy about the price. So arcade action, what's going on in January of 1982? Well, it's not as good as December of 1981, I must say. Top left is a new game called Quix. It says here it's pronounced Kix. So obviously it was what, Q-I-X? I would say that is Quix, but anyway, whatever. Apparently it's pronounced Kix. And it says it is a strategic game. Must admit, I never actually played this game. And I don't know, it's just one of those games that sail me by. Anyway, they seem to be very excited about it, and I think it actually turns up in a competition in a future edition of the magazine. Then we got Choppers and Tanks for 2, and it goes on to say, what is this game called? Armor Attack. It would be nice if they highlighted the name of the game in bold, wouldn't it? That would just help it to sort of leap out from the page a little bit, but there we are. And it says that it's not as, what does it say? It doesn't have the excitement of Battlezone, but it does offer plenty of scope for round the houses maneuvering. So yeah, it doesn't sound like it's as good. That's kind of what they're saying. It's not really as good as Battlezone. And then we got another game here called Moon Shuttle. And again, that's not a game that I remember, at least not from its name. They still haven't got any screenshots, which is, I think is a little bit of a crippling factor to these sort of reviews of arcade games. It would be really nice if you could actually see the arcade game, right? And again, they don't have any sort of review scores or anything like that. They're just sort of describing games as they kind of come out into the arcade. Next, you've got, what does it say here? You can't keep a good frog down, and it says a frog is back in the arcade news with one of the strangest game concepts currently going the rounds. The game, by the looks of it, is called Frog and Spiders, and it puts the player in the amphibious title role as a real tangled web of wildlife drama. It's not a game that I remember, but, you know, we'll put it on screen and maybe it'll ring a bell for you. So on the right-hand side, there's a little bit here. This part of the page is actually to do with tips, and it's talking about Defender. So many an arcade player has written off Defender as requiring one more hand than the usual human complement. Its awesome array of buttons and deadly collection of 6 alien crafts seem to defy mastery. And yet those who have persevered with Defender are the most devoted of players, swearing by the game as the most complete and satisfyingly tactical. I've got to say, I didn't really get on with Defender. I know it's an amazing game, but they've nailed it on the head. It was the number of buttons that you had. From what I recall, it doesn't have a joystick. You go left and you go right by pressing buttons. You fire by pressing buttons. There's a smart bomb. And it's just quite a hard game to master the controls of. Now, that would be true if I were an adult back in these days. But unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, it's just a fact that I was 10 years old. I had smaller hands. It was hard enough to play the game if I was an adult, right? But with little child hands, I had no chance. And I noticed as well that the game was quite often played, the way I would describe it is cock-handed, where people would actually cross their hands over because they would find that, you know, having their hands in the normal orientation, you know, right-handed and left-handed, whatever, didn't work. You had to sort of cross your hands over to play the game. Interesting, fantastic game, but very hard to play. Maybe in the future, I'll get an arcade cabinet and I'll be able to play it. But again, the problem is I'll have an arcade cabinet with joysticks, right? It probably won't have the right complement and setup of buttons to actually play Defender. So yeah, bit of an awkward game, but a classic nonetheless. So one more Atari advert. Yeah, loads of Atari adverts. But actually this is interesting, I suppose, in that it does actually have some peripherals on display there. You can see it's got the Atari game controllers and what classic controllers they are. The Atari was so fundamental that the image of those joysticks became the image of joysticks for a very long time. Yeah, that was kind of like the archetypical joystick at some point. So what are they advertising here? An Atari 400, still £345. Price is the same. Price hasn't really come down. Just below it in the smaller picture, you've got an Atari 800. Now, reading between the lines, I'm assuming the reason why they have the Atari 400 at the top is because that was the big seller. Obviously, the Atari 800 was a lot more expensive. It says there £645. So yeah, you know, most people couldn't afford that. And at a stretch, some people could obviously wrangle together the £345 required to get an Atari 400. But still, it was kind of at the top end of computing. Most people were dealing with ZX81s and machines like that, kit computers that they put together themselves, because £345 was pretty expensive and £645 was pretty extortionate. And yeah, you got the Atari tape recorder there as well. And yeah, another Atari advert. And I'm showing you this one because it's actually from Laskys. We saw Laskys, I think, earlier in this episode. And again, I'm showing it because I like the design. I think it's really nice what they've done. What's really cool is they've actually used the red, the second color in their print, to highlight the word Atari on the computers. And they've actually got a nice black and white illustration of the machines there. I'm assuming the prices aren't any different. In fact, does this even show prices? I don't think it does. So yeah, they're asking you to basically call up these different branches and find out what the prices are of the Atari 800 or 400. So this is a little bit weird. It says Christmas 1982, but it's actually not Christmas 82. It's actually Christmas 1981. So that's confusing. I don't know quite what they were thinking when they did this. This is the January edition of Computer and Video Games from 1982, but it is actually for Christmas 1981. And I am assuming that when this came out, it was still actually during the Christmas period. Maybe the December edition actually came out in November. Then in the middle of December, the January edition came out. So you could still actually buy stuff for Christmas. So I'm assuming that's why they've got here. And this is actually showing you some of the things that would be cool to buy. And we talked about the Watch and Game, or was it Game and Watch? I think it was Game and Watch, wasn't it? And then if you have a look at the top right, you can see you've got a number of them there actually available for purchase. And Parachute, and I can't really see the names of the other one, Octopus. So yeah, I think these are the original games from Nintendo, and they would have been a big hit in the Christmas of 1981. And on the bottom left of the screen, you've got also a bunch of different, they're kind of like, they're not microcomputers, they're handheld games, which would have games like Space Invaders and things like that. And they had a very similar sort of technology to what you would see in the Game and Watch, where, you know, you have a fixed number of places on the screen where your spaceship could go, and the aliens had a fixed number of places where they could go. But all the same, you could actually get a pretty decent game of like Galaga or Galaxians out of it. They definitely have a place in people's hearts. They're very nostalgic, those machines, and some people collect those. I know that I've seen them at the Retro Man Cave. So yeah, interesting times, 1981, and the sort of other devices that you could get around Christmas of that year. Wow, so look at this, a massive spread, double page spread here, loads of stuff. Top left, TRS-80, Model 3. To the right of it, you've got the Apple II. It says at reduced prices, £599 plus VAT. It's not that reduced, is it? Still an expensive machine, but I assume that by this point, maybe they're trying to get the prices down on them a bit. To the right of it, you've got the Apple Disk 2 disk drive, and then underneath you've got the PET, 2 different types of PET there. You've got the Commodore VIC-20. We've got a bunch of different printers here, which is interesting to see. Printers at this point were hot stuff because, you know, if you wanted to actually get your information off your computer and give it to somebody else, if they didn't have a computer, the only way you could do it really was by actually printing it out and giving them a piece of paper. So these days, obviously, we're used to on our phones just sharing things or sending emails. You know, everything in these days was based on paper. We've got a monitor there, bottom left. We've got a Tantel. What's that? Some kind of Prestel device. Prestel, from what I remember, is a sort of TV-based information system, which we'll look at in the future. You've got a TV game, which is, I'm assuming, one of these knockoff consoles that allows you to play games on your TV. That was a common thing back in the day. Then on the right-hand side of the page, it says your ZX80 is no longer redundant. Upgrade your Z80 to the full, what's it called? Animated graphics of the ZX81. No screen flicker. Right, okay, I see. That's pretty basic, isn't it? That you have to put RAM in not to have the screen flickering. It says for only $12.95 plus VAT, you can get this memory expansion. It works only in conjunction with a new 8K ROM from Sinclair, not included. So you have to buy that as well. It says they've got Atari cartridges in stock, but they don't actually list them. Comp Pro mixer, professional audio mixer that you can build yourself. Interesting. TIAC drives, which we saw earlier, actually work with a number of different systems. And then on the right-hand side, top right, there we are, the CompuKit UK 101. We saw that in the hardcore section, didn't we? I don't know, it just feels wrong saying that. But yeah, anyway, yeah, in the hardcore section, that's where we saw the UK 101. So there it is, there's that kit computer. It says it's only £99 plus VAT. And it's got a bunch of different upgrades there. It's very small text, quite hard to read, but interesting. So that's what the UK 101 is. Then you've got the Panasonic automatic telephone system, the Sharp PC12, what is that, a calculator or something? Or like a little microcomputer. Tiny, it says programs in BASIC. So it may actually be like one of those little tiny portable computers that you could get from Sharp. And then it says a selection of Apple interfaces are now available at our Edgware Road showroom. I'm assuming by interfaces they mean cards that you can put into your Apple to extend it. Yeah, there's just so much on this page. So if you want to have a dig around, pause the video and zoom in and see what you can actually read on this page. And finally, for this edition, looks like there wasn't really that much going on. Another one of these pages of multiple items, not much here actually, which is microcomputers, right? It's these handheld games. Galaxy 1000, I'm assuming that's Galaxians. That's £20 for that. Earth Invaders, could that be Space Invaders? I think it could be. £23.95 for that. Speak and Spell, the famous Speak and Spell machine. Adding machine. It looks like quite a fancy looking calculator, that doesn't it? It looks like it's got a little printer on it. Then you've got a 24-tune electronic doorbell. I don't know why that's in a magazine for microcomputers. Mattel TV game. Oh, I think that was quite a cool console, wasn't it? Yeah. Then you got teletext add-on adapter. So teletext was a data system that could be viewed on a TV, and it came through the actual broadcast signal. But you had to have a TV with a teletext decoder, and TVs around this time would have been sold with those built in. But if you had an older TV, you can actually buy an add-on adapter. I don't know who would have done that, because that is quite expensive. £200 for that. Wow. Top right, Space Invaders. What is that? Handheld Invaders? Very tiny text, can't read. To the left of it, you got the Atari TV game. Don't know why it's called the Atari TV game. It's quite obviously the VCS. Maybe it was branded as the TV game in the UK. I don't remember it being branded as that, but yeah, I've seen people refer to it as the TV game. Now, interestingly, Silica Shop, they went on to become a big brand in mail order sales. I think I can remember them being very big during the Amiga era, but they're actually around at this point in 1981. So that was the main reason I actually showed you this advert, because interesting to see Silica Shop turning up so early, but also it's quite interesting to see these various devices that were part of the cloud of technology of microcomputing during the Christmas period of 1981. Amazing, eh? What a trip down memory lane. There's a lot that actually went on in December and January. The timing of those magazines is a bit confusing. The way you have the Christmas feature in January seems a bit odd, but from what I remember, the way magazines were printed was always like a month in advance. So the December edition probably actually would have come out in November, maybe early November. I suppose the idea was that it was aiming to show you what would be available in December. So because of that, it was a month early. It was quite confusing sometimes, but that would have also meant that the January 82 edition actually came out in December of 81 and probably would have been the last edition that you got, which actually had the toys in for that period. So that's why it's a little bit confusing. What were my highlights of the last two editions? Well, the video games in December were amazing. Seeing Donkey Kong come out, I mean, that was kind of crazy when I first read that. I know it sounds obvious that obviously not everything came out. I mean, what's happened now is like the history of video games is kind of being compressed, like peat in a bog. So everything seems incredibly close together. You know, it almost feels like Mission Impossible, Donkey Kong, what else could I say? Almost like the Amiga. They all kind of happened at the same time. And of course they didn't. It all happened over a period of years. You know, things like, for instance, Space Invaders would have come out, I suppose, what, in the 70s? But then you're talking about Donkey Kong, which was actually a little bit later and more sophisticated. Donkey Kong being, from what I understand, pretty much the first platform game, as it became to known later. I think at the time it was called a climbing game because, well, you climb up the girders. But over time, that genre became known as a platformer. So it's interesting that Donkey Kong was one of the first platformers, or the first platformer out there. And it's also interesting that Nintendo at this point in time are such a small company. They've got one hit, which is Donkey Kong. That kind of came out of the blue to some degree. And then they've got the Game & Watch, which we looked at, which actually then propelled them on to becoming a very successful company, giving them the funds and the experience to some degree, I suppose, to actually then put together their own console, the Nintendo Entertainment System, which came along obviously later in the decade. What else was interesting in this edition? I think it's remarkable how many kit computers there are at this time. Obviously, that would have been kicked off in the 70s over in the US with machines, I think, like the Altair, the IMSI 8080 and things like that, where I think you actually mainly built those yourself. You would get the parts and construct it to some degree or another. The Apple I, of course, was famously a kit computer that you had to put together, I think. I'm not sure you could actually ever get it assembled. But even by 1981, some 4 years later, well, actually 5 years later, you still have kit computers available. And it's there really to try and keep the costs down. So a repeating theme of these videos is that the budget over in the UK for computing is still pretty low. As I said earlier, the economy is not doing very well. Most people are struggling to pay for things. You know, a couple of years ago, that would have been, it would have seemed a little bit alien to people, but I think people understand what it's like now when, for instance, right now we have high inflation, and that means that the cost of living has gone really high. And that means a lot of people are struggling to pay bills. And so when that happens, things which are relatively frivolous, like a microcomputer for your child, they tend to be put on hold, and you start giving your children lesser gifts because you have to make ends meet, right? So that's what it was like, I think, for a lot of people in the UK back in the early 80s. Things were not great. Money was not flying around. And therefore, the Atari 800s of this world, the Apple IIs, the Tandy TRS-80s, they weren't really affordable for most people. And that's why you have a place over in the UK, especially for the kit computers and also the very low-cost computers coming out from Sinclair, the ZX80 and the ZX81. Machines which were barely functional by today's standards, but back then they were actually microcomputers that people could use and start getting into the technology. And if you think about it, why would you spend £600, which is thousands of pounds today, to buy a computer, not even knowing if you would like it? It actually would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it, to pay a lot less money, get yourself one of those much cheaper computers, try them out, see if you really enjoy it and actually get some benefit from it. And then if you did, save up your money and then buy one of the more expensive machines down the line. Anyway, I won't waffle on for too long because this video is obviously very long already. Let me know if you like this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed making it. In some ways, I think it was actually more fun than the previous edition because I think there was some really great stuff going on in the arcade in this particular edition. You know, Donkey Kong and Gallagher and Frogger and things like that. And I enjoyed a lot of the stuff in the magazine. There was obviously some repetition. I mean, obviously each edition of the magazine couldn't be completely unique from the last. You're going to get things repeating. So hopefully in the next video, we'll be able to put together, again, 2 episodes into one video to keep things moving along nicely. So you know the score. If you did like this video, please hit the like button, give it a donk that like button. And if you've not seen our videos before and you would like to see more, then please subscribe. And if you are already a subscriber, or if you're a new subscriber, please make sure you hit that bell, because if you don't, you won't get notifications about our videos. You'll be subscribed, but you won't actually know about anything that we do. So please make sure you click on the bell so that you get notifications, and that includes you who have already subscribed. Please click that bell so you get notifications about our videos in the future. Okay? Also, don't forget that we now have a membership for our channel. You can click the join button, and that will actually help us to grow the channel, because, you know, buying the equipment and putting these videos together does take a lot of time and effort. And I hope you appreciate that and can also, you know, help by joining the channel. It doesn't cost much money to join. There are different tiers, and you can join whichever tier you feel comfortable with. You know, by all means, start with the lowest tier and then go up if you feel like it. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you in the next one. But until then, take care.